because you're going to either have questions or want to comment. I know it. Genesis is what we're studying, right? Genesis, and we are in chapter 6 to begin today. I mentioned to you last week as we ended, if you want to read the genealogy there in chapter 5 and kind of notice some things about that, especially when we talk about men like Enoch and how he walked with God, right? That was kind of interesting. We also left off Methuselah. He died the year of the flood. Did he die in the flood or before the flood? We don't know. We'd like to think he died before the flood, but... and then, so chapter 6, right? There's chapter 6 really kind of gets us into the flood account. And we think about the flood account, there was a lot of different civilizations that had their own sort of flood account or, tales of a flood, right? We might refer to them as the ancient Near Eastern, stories that talks about the flood. One of the most probably, I guess, popular, so to speak, and you've probably at least heard of this, I don't know if you've read it, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Anybody read the Epic of Gilgamesh? Okay, I don't know. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is kind of an ancient Near Eastern flood account. There are some things that are kind of similar, some similarities, but there are also some differences that I think certainly stand out that we would notice that this is not what we read about in Genesis, right? For example, some of the similarities. Utnapishtim is the name of the character in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Utnapishtim, right? You spell that one. By the way, I had to spell that for a test, so trying to memorize just how to spell his name was kind of part of the challenge there. But they both built a boat, he and Noah. In both accounts, all people were destroyed that weren't inside of the boat. In both accounts, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. In both accounts, they sent out birds in search of dry land. And in both accounts, they offer sacrifices when exiting. But then there's also some differences, and that is, namely, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are multiple gods, versus, of course, we know the one God of the Bible. There is, of course, in our biblical account, the flood is a result of the righteous punishment for sin. Versus in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's just kind of the gods seeking revenge on mankind for, being a little too righteous or, disturbing the peace or whatever you may have it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the boat is built in 7 days, or of course we know it was about 100 years there on account of Noah and what we read, what he did. And the gods in Gilgamesh are weak, fearful, and threatened by the waters. And we know, of course, our God is not any of that. So there are certainly some differences there in that. And of course, we think about this account. Before we get to that, though, there's some other things that we read about in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 6. And I want to hit on this first because I know it's probably a question that you have, a question that I have. We may have talked about this a little bit before. But beginning in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, "Now it came about." Now this is, following what we have in chapter 5 with the different genealogies, right? Now it came about when mankind began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of mankind were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years." Now, that kind of sort of ends that particular thought. The question here, of course, many people ask is, who are the sons of God, right? There's a few different options for this, a few different thoughts on this. I'll kind of give you the most popular sort of ideas on this or thoughts. And there's probably like maybe 3 that are really kind of, I guess, more popular than others as far as thoughts on who are the sons of God. One, for example, is that the sons of God are angels. This is one of the earliest interpretations. We see that in Job, where the phrase sons of God refers to angels. And this was kind of a popular thing during the intertestamental period. A lot of the intertestamental period writings referred to these sons of God as being angels. That was the kind of the prevailing thought then. Doesn't make it right, just saying that's what they thought. And also some of the early manuscripts of the Septuagint have angels of God here. When they translated it from Hebrew into Greek, they translated it as angels instead of sons, right? Again, doesn't make it right. It just kind of letting you know that's some of the thoughts on that particular theory there. And so there are some who believe that that could be the case. And then others believe that the sons of God are just merely referring to humans, right? We know the sons of God in the intertestament period can also refer to righteous people. In fact, that's the meaning in the New Testament, right? In the New Testament, when you read that phrase, sons of God, oftentimes that phrase is used in the New Testament in reference to those who are righteous, right? We think about us as being sons of God, right? So we would look at that and we would say, okay, that refers to someone who is righteous. And then, of course, the point of the text there in the first few verses there seems to be on the beauty of the women, and thus the motivation behind the marriages was lust. And so that would make sense if it were human. Some say that they were judges. I don't know how much that weight holds. This is one that I had never really heard before, but I think has some merit to it. And this, again, because we're coming off of the genealogies here, but there are some who say that the sons of God refers to what you might call Sethites, or the sons or the descendants of Seth. And one of the reasons is because there's two things. You think about Cain's descendants and Seth's descendants, right? Because we know Abel, of course, was killed. So when you look at those two men, in Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 24, Cain's genealogy is represented as having some wicked men. Lamech is one of those, right? So you kind of think about Cain and what he did, and you think about some of those that came after him that the Bible is specific about, such as Lamech, and you kind of get the idea that Cain's descendants weren't exactly righteous, so to speak. But then when you go to Genesis 4, verses 25 through chapter 5 and verse 32, which is the end of chapter 5, Adam's genealogy through Seth is represented as having some righteous men in it. We think about Enoch, right? He walked with God. Or Noah, as we're going to read about here in Genesis chapter 6, who was one who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and therefore, of course, was commissioned to build the ark. And so, this is one of the thoughts that maybe that's who the sons of God is in reference to, the descendants of Seth, or the Sethites, as we may call it. And so, those are just kind of some of the main theories as to who and what that was. I know we talked about this before. In fact, Juan and I have kind of discussed this. I think I had it one night in question. I said it could be angels here. Still maybe a possibility. After taking this class on Genesis and studying all this, I may be leaning more towards this idea of being Seth's descendants here because of the righteousness that seems to come from his descendants. Again, I mentioned Enoch and Noah and individuals like that. But, the text just calls them sons of God, right? So it doesn't really specifically tell us who that is. But that is separate, by the way, from verse 4. And so I think sometimes we maybe get the idea that the sons of God and the daughters of men, that they bore the Nephilim in verse 4, but that's actually seems to be in the text or in the narrative a separate thought from what we just discussed. It just says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of mankind, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And so kind of a side note, or maybe a parenthetical note there on that. But it's kind of interesting that's there right before or as we end there. And of course, remember, when you first get Genesis, right, it's not broken up into chapter and verse divisions. So, sometimes we read those chapter and verse divisions and we think, okay, the genealogy's done, we ended that, and now we're into something completely different in chapter 6, and maybe we're tempted to tie in these first few verses in with the flood. But again, that wasn't there originally, so it would have just been sort of a continuous reading there. So, don't let that chapter and verse division kind of like trick you or fool you. It would have been originally just kind of a continuous reading, and any kind of manuscripts that we would have had on Genesis or any early copies of this as well. Josh, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to ask you concerning like when it mentions there like the giants, who were they and stuff like that.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not really sure who they were. I mean, it just says they were on the earth. It doesn't really tell us exactly who they were. And I think this is kind of falls under one of those things that we don't really know for sure. I mean, we might guess at this or guess at that, but I don't know that we really know for sure. Who they were or what the deal was. They weren't on the earth for very much longer. Obviously, go ahead, Roger.
I don't know if you're in the mood for another guess, but some kind of a mark was put on Cain at one point so that other people wouldn't mess with him when they came by him. And maybe it was that he was made large. He was just a big person. And subsequent to that, maybe these other people, Nephilim can be translated as mighty men. Maybe they were just huge dudes that found the descendants of Seth attractive, and yonder you go.
If he was big, I wouldn't mess with him. He wouldn't need a mark there. Just, go ahead. It's coming. The microphone's coming.
There's a reference in Numbers when the report of the spies came back.
Right.
Of the giants, and they're called Nephilim. So, evidently they were just very big people.
Yeah, and we kind of see that today. Like if you go to certain places, there are certain people, certain cultures that are just smaller in stature, and then they're look at our country. Look at the NBA. Have you ever been near an NBA player or somebody who's really tall? Like I'm talking like 6'9", 6'10", 6'11", 7 foot tall. I mean they're huge, right? Look at Shaq, right? And those you ever seen them like when they go somewhere else? They go to like another country, and people are just like, whoa, they look like giants. We might even refer to them as giants, right? But that's just it's just a genetic thing with them. Like maybe their parents were kind of tall, and they also were tall, or whatever the case is, right? So as we think about that, yeah, it's not uncommon for there to be people today that we might even kind of look at and say, man, they're a bunch of giants, right? I think the microphone's over. Yes, sir.
Ryan, I was kind of leaning like you were, as it said, the sons of God, those that are righteous. Because when Jesus comes on the scene, he reminds them, like the angels in heaven, they neither married nor given into marriage. And it says here in the scripture that they married, so that'd be kind of hard to get around that.
Yeah. And I could probably give out a lot of pros, cons of each one. We don't really have time to dive into all of that. I did want to start with it because I knew that it's probably a question that you probably have had, or maybe you've looked at, or maybe you've thought about before. And so just wanted to give some ideas as to what that could possibly be. We'll go here and then back over this way. Go ahead.
Yesterday I was watching public television, and the Antique Roadshow, and they had a shoe that a woman brought in that was, and I didn't catch the size, but she said it was made by a cobbler in their neighborhood for a giant. And it was about size 20 or something like that. And she said that this man was 8'3", I believe it was.
Wow.
And that wasn't, that was in not too long ago. So I thought that was interesting. You brought that up, and I saw that yesterday. The shoe is so big, the girl played in it when she was a little girl.
Huh. Wow. Yeah, and you think about Goliath, too. I mean, look at how big Goliath was, just kind of how it went. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that was my point, that there were very, very tall people in the earth is not even disputed. I mean, the archaeology and bones, and I was going to bring up Goliath, it says that in 1 Samuel 16:4 that he was 6 cubits in a span, and a cubit most thought were about 18 inches. So he is estimated to be 9 feet 9 inches, about close to me, about my height,
Right.
So, but so that there were giants, they're just big people,
Yeah.
and likely bigger than we have generally now.
Yeah. And especially, if you're kind of in a war like Israelites were with the Philistines, if they tend to be bigger people, you kind of feel like you're at a disadvantage. Or, as it was already mentioned, going into the land, spying out the land. And one of the reasons why 10 of those spies were afraid is because they looked at the size of some of those people and they're like, hey, they're bigger than us. Like, and that's just sort of a natural thing. Like you generally don't pick on somebody that's bigger than you, right? Generally you're not going to do that. And so, just kind of seeing that, you're like, whoa, look how big they are. And so, yeah, it's not anything uncommon back then, but it's not even still uncommon today. The fact that there are people who are just bigger. So yeah, and where how exactly does that work? I don't know. I mean, like people look at me and go, oh, your dad must be tall. My dad's like 5'7" or 5'8". He's not that tall, right? So sometimes it happens, right? I just whatever. Maybe I don't know. So yeah. There was a time there where there was those individuals who were large like that. But I just want to point that out before we get into, but we want to move on because we want to talk about the flood and then kind of moving there to chapter 10. I think one of the things that obviously stands out about this is just, we look at things like, the first few verses of chapter 6, and we can talk about, what are the Nephilim and where do they come from and, and what about the sons of God and all that. But when it comes to what we learn from Scripture, I think the most important thing in chapter 6 is obviously what happened with Noah and the state of the world at that particular time. The Bible says there in verse 5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So the Lord was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And then the Lord said, I will wipe out mankind whom I've created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, and crawling things and the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. So, how quickly, and I know we look at genealogies and we think, well, man, there's hundreds of years have passed, but, from the time that everything was created and God looked at everything and he said that it was good, or when he finished creation that it was very good. And now we get to the point where God looks out over the world and he sees the wickedness of mankind, and it was great on the earth. It wasn't just minimal or medium or kind of bad. It was great on the earth. And so much so that the Bible describes it in these terms: every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. That's all they thought about. That's all they did. And so you talk about how bad things were, and you think about how much or what has to happen to get people to, sometimes people are bad because they don't know any better. Sometimes, like you think about a kid maybe who's not yet been taught properly, or who just doesn't know right from wrong yet. Sometimes people are bad because they don't understand or they don't know. And if that's the case, sometimes you say, okay, well, we can correct that by teaching what's right and helping them understand to correct their behavior. But when you think about how difficult it is to correct a world in which the Bible describes it as not only was the wickedness great, but at every intent, like their intentions behind their thoughts, right? Whatever they thought about, the intention behind it was bad. In other words, you and I would say, yeah, we wish good upon our neighbor, right? We think about the world at large, we think about others, and we wish good upon them. We wish well to them, right? That wasn't where they were. Every intention behind their thought was only evil. Continually, all the time, that's all they thought about. How difficult would it be to basically conform or transform a world like that, right? I mean, Noah preached for 100 years, but when people are in that kind of a state, it's very difficult to get them away from or out of that. Now, how does all that happen? Well, I mean, it happens over time, but, the world was in a very bad place. And so that's the reason why when God looked at it, the Bible says that he was sorry that he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And his intention at that point was, I'm going to wipe out mankind whom I've created. Animals as well, crawling things. I'm going to start over, right? Because of how bad things were. But, and we see this in verse 8, but Noah found favor or grace in the eyes of the Lord. In other words, yes, there was great wickedness upon the earth, but there was this man who was different than the rest, who was not like the rest. And notice that God saw that. And I think there's something to be said about this because, we think about passages in Scripture such as Elijah. When Elijah was so discouraged after the victory on Mount Carmel and after essentially there Jezebel threatened him, his life and said, I'm gonna kill you, basically. And so he flees and he's discouraged. And he makes this statement that he thought that he was the only one who had not bowed his knee to Baal, right? You think about how difficult that must be to think that you are the only person who hasn't succumbed or given over to evil. Now, God assured him that there were also, I think it was like 4,000 who had not bowed their knee to Baal. But think about this situation when the world is just wicked, and yet it's not there were 4,000 who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. There was this one man, Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And he was trying to be different in a time where it was probably pretty difficult to do so based upon how everyone else was and how everyone else was living their life. And so we see there, verse 9 tells us a little bit more about Noah. Verses 9 and 10, these are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Same thing we see about Enoch, right, in chapter 5. And, of course, Noah was going down that lineage of Seth. Okay, we see Noah in that lineage as well. And Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, verse 11, we go back to this. Now, the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. So that gives you a little more, we say, okay, wickedness, but what does that mean? Well, here, the Bible specifies that there was a lot of violence, okay? A lot of violence there. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth, which simply means this: man had gotten away from following God and doing what God had created for him to do and who he created for him to be. And so it was all corrupted. And so beginning in verse 13, we see where we have these instructions about building the ark. God says to Noah, the end of humanity has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of people. Noah probably knew that. And behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with compartments covered inside and out with pitch. He goes on and talks about the length of 300 cubits, the width of 50, and the height of 30. It's been said that this was, the dimensions, so to speak, was really the perfect dimensions for a seaworthy ship. He talks about there in verse 16 making a window, finishing it to a cubit from the top, right? And putting the door of the ark on the side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And then he talks about bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh and a breath of life from under heaven. Everything that's on the earth shall perish. Now, when he made that boat, did you notice there's something missing in the from that boat? If you're a boating person, you're a boater or whatever, any kind of boat, right? What do you think is missing from that boat? Rudder, right? A way to steer that boat. Or motor or something like that, right? Maybe some oars sticking out the side. You can kind of, Why do you think that was the case? What do you think? That's right. Yeah. Look, all Noah needs to worry about is you're not drowning in the water, right? You just need to float. God's going to take care of you and where you end up and all that, right? And so I think there's probably a lesson there that you and I can think about in regards to even our own lives. That we allow God to steer us where He would have us to go. Here's kind of a question I think that we maybe think about as we move forward there in the instructions that He gives there. He talks about bringing them on there. Look at verse 19. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kind, of the animals according to their kind, of every crawling thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. As for yourself, take yourself some of every food that's edible. Gather it for yourself. It shall be food for you and for them. So Noah did these things according to everything that God commanded, so did he. So Noah did everything that God commanded him. Not just some things, right, but everything. But I want to go back to the animals. He talks about 2 of every kind there in verse 19. But then when you get to chapter 7, you see this. Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 pairs of every clean animal, a male and female, and 2 of the animals that are not clean, a male and female, and also the birds of the sky, 7 pairs, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So here he kind of gets more specific with Noah with the idea of these animals. It was essentially, if it was an unclean animal, he was to bring 2. If it was a clean animal, he was to bring 7. Now, why do you think that's the case? Why do you think God did that? Let's say it again, Ray. All right, for one, something to eat, right? It would be, really it kind of appears that up to this point, man was kind of basically vegetarian. But after he would get off the ark, God would essentially give him permission now to eat the flesh, not the blood, but to eat the flesh of the animals that were clean, right? Not unclean, but clean. Well, why else, do you think? Sacrifice, okay. So, if he was going to make a sacrifice, right, you think about, and maybe there's a theory for you, right? What happened to dinosaurs and all that, and maybe he had some on the ark, and then he got off, he said, don't make a sacrifice, I'm going to sacrifice Tyrannosaurus Rex, because I don't like him anyway. But it was also to offer sacrifice, right? Because when he gets off of the ark, we see that one of the first things that Noah does is he does offer sacrifices to God. And so if you only had 2 of every animal, you're sitting there going, okay, well, I mean, if I make a sacrifice at this point, whatever animal I sacrifice, well, that's it. That animal's gone. There's no more, right? So God makes that provision so that moving forward or coming off the ark, he's making that provision so that Noah will be able to have some of those clean animals to be able to eat, right? Because God's given him the permission to do that, and also to be able to make those sacrifices before him. So, that's sometimes we maybe scratch our heads a little bit and wonder why God did that, but I think that's really the reason why, when you think about it, why God did those things as well. So God does that. Noah, he makes the boat, right? He does. I want to reiterate again, chapter 7, verse 5. Noah acted in accordance with everything that the Lord had commanded him, right? He did everything God asked him to do. And then the waters come, right? He gets all of these animals upon the boat, and they load up on the ark there. And the Bible tells us that as they get on the boat there, down in about verse 11, 600th year of Noah's life, 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. The rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and for 40 nights. And so as they got on that boat, of course, we'll see in a moment, God closes that door behind him. But here's what, we think about, where does all that water come from, and how does it flood like that? There's a few things. Number one, the Bible says the fountains of the great deep open up, right? So you've got water coming up from below, okay? And then you've got the windows of heaven, so to speak, or, a lot of them thought, and you go back to, I think it's the word in Hebrew for firmament, but it kind of the idea of the sky, and I think we talked about this the first week, was that the sky was kind of like a canopy, but it was like the sky was sort of holding the water back. And in this moment, it's kind of like, you ever have like a tent or something in your backyard or some kind of covering, and it rains. Maybe it's like plastic or something, and it rains, and you see the water building up on it, and it kind of starts to droop down a little bit. And then, you might do several things, right? Maybe you take the stick and kind of hit it and knocks the water off the side. But maybe you just cut a hole in it. And if you do that, what happens to all that water? It's just going to pour out, right? So what happens is the canopy or the windows of heaven opens up. In other words, all that water that's sort of been being held back, it's opened up. And so now you've got water coming up from the ground. You've got water pouring down. And it rained hard for 40 days and 40 nights. I think I've told this before, but, it's been several years ago now. But it happened one year. We were at Florida Bible Camp. I remember it probably may have been around 2010, 2011, something like that. It was before I know our kids were old enough to go, but we got there on Sunday afternoon, and there was a tropical storm that had kind of stalled out right there, and it just sat on top of that area. And literally from the time we got there on Sunday afternoon to camp, it was pouring rain. It didn't stop raining until Wednesday evening. I remember, well, first of all, I remember trying to have camp. We were trying to do sports, and kids were falling because it was wet and rainy, and they couldn't dry their clothes because you couldn't hang anything outside because it was just raining all the time, and you tried to hang it up on the inside, but there was limited space. And anyway, it was just kind of a mess. And I remember Wednesday night walking back to the cabins, and I remember looking up and seeing the sky for the first time in like 4 or 5 days. And it kind of had finally moved out and cleared on. I was like, wow. And so, that was kind of, and then the next day we found out, Thursday, that the water levels were rising still, and they were going to be rising for a few days, but started to cover the road, that Bible camp road, that sort of, if you've ever been to Bible camp there, there's that, gravel road, dirt road, whatever, and it started to kind of go over that road, like flood over that road. And we see these big military vehicles pull in, and they're like, hey, look, water levels are rising. That bridge going out is already out. You guys got to get out of here. If you stay here, you'll be fine here, but you're going to be here for probably a couple weeks. And I'm like, nah, we ain't doing this. Like, I don't care if we got enough food or whatever. No. So we had to, somebody talked to the gentleman who owned the property kind of behind it when you go to the back of the softball field. And he had a road, which was like where the power lines run. And he agreed. He cut his fence open there for us. And we started loading kids, and we got people to call, parents, and we loaded kids in like church vans, and we would drive them out all the way through that road to the main road, and parents would pick them up. We'd come back, we'd get more kids, we'd take them out, right? We just, we were getting them out of there. And the water levels kind of continued to rise. But it was amazing, like, to see it, right? The Santa Fe River is down that road a little further, but the water levels had already come all the way up that road, and it was crazy. And that was after like 4 days of rain. So you can imagine after 40 days and nights of hard rain, just how that would flood the earth, not to mention the fountains of the deep opening up and so again, that shows us that's what it took to be able to do all of that. But they get into the boat, and the Bible says that God closed the door behind him, right? That was God's decision. We think about if it was up to Noah, right? And it starts raining, and Noah's kind of, all right, let's get in, and he starts to close that door. You might imagine people nearby running. Noah, okay, yeah. Okay, now we believe you. Can we get in the boat? And Noah might have been like, yeah, come on, whatever. And then, wait, my cousin's coming. He's right behind me. Just give me, and right? So who was it that closed the door? It's God, right? Okay? And I think we need to appreciate that fact. And I think Noah was probably glad that God was the one that was doing all of that. Because God was the one who would make that determination as to when time was up. As to when, after all that preaching, that it was going to be too late. That was God's decision, not Noah's. Noah's job was to build the ark and was to preach the message, right? And God's job was to say, look, I'll tell you what to do, you do it, and I'll shut the door once you get in. And so God made that provision. God made sure that they were shut up safely in that ark, right? So they're there, and of course we know that they're in that boat for some time, and then finally the waters start to subside. And of course we know that Noah ends up sending out the birds there, the doves and such, to be able to find out whether or not there is dry land. And we see that there in chapter 8. We see in verses, I think it's in verses 6 through 12, when he sends out the raven and the dove to test out the water levels there. And then in verses 13 through 19, when there's finally dry land, they're actually able to go out and kind of get out of the boat finally for the first time. And you think about what, how that must have been for him, like the first time that he was able to finally get out of that boat after spending all that time in that boat, right? It had to be kind of dark and probably didn't smell too good, and that kind of stuff. And finally he's able to get out. And after, you ever been on a cruise before? And you know the boat is, and then when you get off, you're walking around, what do you feel? Well, I'm on dry ground, but I still feel that, right? Go ahead, Brother Juan.
Everything that's going on, and it kind of, reminds me of the same situation of, God being patient. And even before, probably, I think the 120 years is probably the time that God gave them to people to repent. And at the end, no one really did, but God is very patient and very loving and long-suffering. And we saw it also with Abraham when, God showed him the promised land in the future and said that, that will come to your descendants, and that it will come in 4 generations, 400 and something years, because the sins of the Amalekites are not complete. But I think that's what's happened here. Here's God is very, very, God does things at His timing, and He's very long-suffering and very, He knows what He's doing. And I think He's just, in the same sense, He's trying to be very, very patient, because there's people in the world that, hearts that He knows need to be reached, and it needs to be at His time. And I think that's where God is very long-suffering, and He's waiting for every opportunity. Even, Jesus said that when He comes again, of course, He was man that time too, will there be any faithful at the time? So we don't know when it's going to happen by us. Yes, we'd love to say, yeah, Jesus, come today. But if He comes today, there's people that I love and that I care about that will be doomed for eternities. Yet God is so loving and so kind and so long-suffering that He's given everybody every last-minute opportunity. Back in Noah's time, it's probably 120 years,
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening now.
Yeah, and we think about life oftentimes in regards to, and not that I don't think we're purposely being selfish, but we tend to think about things in terms of me and how it affects me in my life and all that kind of stuff. But God sees the whole picture, right? He sees everybody, how it affects every person. So while we may say, yes, Lord, come back, God is also looking at other people in other places and other nations and all this. And so His timing, you're right, His timing is the best timing, and His timing is right. Doesn't mean we can't ask and pray that because it's biblical, but His timing is always going to be best and right. Brother John, go ahead.
There's great evidence of the flood, but it's interesting the interpretations that modern science puts on these things. I've had the occasion to visit the Petrified Forest as well as Grand Canyon. Petrified Forest is one of the most interesting places one can go, and you have these huge logs, some of them 8 feet thick, but they're all lying down. Not all, but some are still protruding out of sand hills in the area. It looks like somebody's been chopping wood, but it's not wood. It is petrified, meaning that the silt got into the pores of the wood on one occasion, and when the wood decayed and it left the rocks behind. The park ranger said, well, millions of years ago this happened, and this, instead of a flood of Noah's day, this was a swamp at that time. And we're talking about one of the driest places in the United States, but back then it was a swamp. It had to be that.
Right. Millions of years ago, I had a cousin that was there, right? Yeah, it always tickles me when they, millions of years ago. No, you're right. Yeah, and that, I mean, for us, we understand, right? That points to a flood, a universal flood, not a local flood. This wasn't just a local flood. This was a universal flood. And you see evidence like that for it, right? And so we know that. And by the way, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, there's a lot of stories in ancient Near Eastern accounts that have flood accounts. In other words, even though they took that and they sort of adapted it to their whatever they came up with, there's no doubt that there was a flood that happened. And they didn't deny it back then, right? And so they all admitted to that. Chapter 9 kind of basically, they come off the boat. God, of course, we see there, He makes this covenant. I mentioned there, verse 3 of chapter 9, every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you, right? And so He is able to eat flesh but not blood, of course. he talks about there, verse 6, backing up to verse, into verse 5, from every person, from every man is his brother, I'll require the life of a person. Whoever sheds human blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made mankind. As for you, be fruitful, multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in it. Of course, we know he creates that rainbow in the sky as the sign of that covenant that he made between himself, mankind, that he would never destroy the earth again by flood. And of course, we think about that still today when we see a rainbow in the sky or something along those lines, right? Here's something I want to kind of hint at before we finish, because I know, again, it's a question. I'm not going to get too much into this. I know we're all adults in here, right? But verse 20 talks about here this sin. Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew that what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants. He shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be his servant." So the question here is obviously, what did Ham do? What was the sin that he kind of committed here when it comes to this particular thing? Obviously there was something that had to do with his nakedness. It said that Noah uncovered himself in verse 21. He drank some of the wine, became drunk. He uncovered himself in his tent. Ham, in verse 22, says that he saw the nakedness of his father, told his two brothers outside. Shem and Japheth, as a result of that, they take a garment, they lay it on both their shoulders, they walk backwards so that they did not see their father's nakedness, and they cover his nakedness. So it kind of seems like maybe perhaps it's a sin of maybe omission. In other words, Ham did nothing to correct his father's embarrassing situation about being naked and uncovered. Instead, he kind of told his brothers and laughed. His brothers acted with greater respect for their father by walking backwards to cover him. But then, the question then is this, because it says in verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So it almost sounds like that there was more to it than just Ham seeing his father's nakedness, that he had done something, right? Now, again, I don't want to get graphic and talk about that, but the question is, what exactly did he do? But whatever he did there was obviously a sin, and obviously he was punished as a result of that, and we see that coming down through his lineage as well when it comes to that. Chapter 10 just kind of gives us the descendants of Noah, kind of his lineage, as we kind of saw in chapter 5. So there's just, again, that lineage there in chapter 10. When we come back together next week, we'll jump into chapter 11 in the Tower of Babel. We'll talk about that. We'll kind of cover some things moving forward there. But that's all I got for this morning. So thank you for your comments, your attention, and that's it. Bell should be ringing any second.